Welcome. My name is Tanaka Mhishi, and I'll introduce the rest of our panel in a second. So this is the session on male survivors and masculinities, and just want to say a really big thank you for coming upstairs with us today. I hope you're having a really, it's an odd thing to say, but I hope you're having a really good, enjoyable day, even given what we're here to tackle and to discuss together. So I've been told that I should open this with a piece of poetry. I didn't resist that much because I'm a terrible show-off. But I wanted to share this, and it's a little bit of a meta piece. It's about what it's like to kind of put your story out into the world as a survivor. It's kind of based on an experience I had writing a play about my experiences of sexual violence. So I'm going to stop doing preamble because it's a thing people do when they're nervous. This is the conversation. The guy who is going to play me on stage has a voice that only speaks in major key. So when he talks, my mind throws up the words accident, soliloquy. This is an old technique I have for distracting myself. It works when they tell you about that odd lump or a burst water main. I'm sitting under a blanket that has not been cleaned since I brought it back from India, on the sofa bed that has not been cleaned since I was raped. And that is what we talk about. He speaks a lot and listens more. I keep sandwiching my feelings in between statistics, and he keeps calling me mate to make me feel like we are colleagues. Like this is the sort of thing that people talk about on a Wednesday morning in February. And I know all about things that happen on a Wednesday morning in February. I tell him about the police, the off-the-record chat, the way the pavement seemed to slide beneath my knees. We make magic this way. I give him every small piece of suffering, each rape joke someone made, each trip around the supermarket, duck diving away from the guy with my rapist's haircut. Every night when the dark boiled in from the windows and pooled around me, I tell him about the times when it nearly drowned me. He listens a lot and speaks. 2 weeks later, I see me in his bones as he performs, feel the crowd buck and sway. People cry. I don't. He says my words his way, and his way becomes the truth. I wrote myself an ending I could live with, so now living with this is something I can do. I walk out into the night, humming music in a major key. It's a Christmas song in February, a loop of notes that change the shape of this damn year. And thank God I learned to say all this. And thank God that I'm still here. Thank you. Notes and reviews to the usual place. So I was going to do the introduction thing, and then I realized that would mean reading out my own bio, which is very cringe. So instead, I thought we would just introduce ourselves. So Ben, do you want to kick us off?
Are you not going to start?
No.
Wow. Okay, no problem. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Hurst. I am... Oh, it's horrible. I hate introductions so much. I hate them.
Did check in that everyone was happy to do this.
And I was like, yeah, no, fine. And in my mind, I was like, no, Ben, don't do it. It's horrible because what do you say? Like, what do you do? I don't want to define myself by what I do. I'm the head of facilitation and training at an organization called Beyond Equality, which is an organization that works in schools and universities and corporates, engaging men and boys in the gender equality conversation, particularly through the lens of masculinities. So I do that, and I do a bunch of other stuff, which is also cool and interesting. I'd say follow me on social media, but I'm not really using it. So that's all you need to know for today. I think is that okay? Is that a good enough intro?
Yeah.
No problem.
You can send your notes and reviews on that as well to the usual
Please
place.
don't. Do not.
Hello, my name's George Severs, and I am one of the Shame team. You've heard a lot about the Shame Project today, mainly from the wonderful Joanna Burke, who's here today. And if you want to find out more about the Shame Project, there are leaflets in the back to my right-hand corner that you can pick up on the way out today. So my background is I'm a historian of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Britain. Mainly, my work today has focused on activism and kind of activist responses to HIV and AIDS. But the work I'm doing at the moment, as part of the Shame Project as a postdoc, is looking at the way in which the AIDS crisis impacted the work of medics and psychiatrists and sexual health workers dealing with survivors of sexual violence. And as part of that, I'm thinking about male survivors of sexual violence and male survivors of rape, and that's what we're thinking about today.
Thank you. And I'm Tanaka Mhishi. As you saw, I'm a poet, and I write plays, and I've just written a book. So if there are any literary agents in the audience, plug. But the majority of my work centers on survivors of sexual violence with a particular focus on male survivors. I have performed in 2 or 3 shows aimed at starting conversations about masculinity, and I'm a trustee for Survivors UK, who are one of the UK's leading sexual violence services that support male and non-binary survivors. And yeah, thank you all for being here. I wanted to start off, if that's all right with you, just talking about kind of that history, because that's not a thing we have a lot in, I guess, men's equality spaces, as a sense of the history of these movements. And I wonder if you could tell us some of the exciting things you've discovered.
Sure. Well, I mean, it comes as no surprise to lots of you that some of what I'll say here does reflect the history of female survivors of sexual violence. But one of the main issues that comes up when you're researching the history of male survivors of sexual violence is a theme of invisibility and a theme of kind of state-level data not reflecting what's going on the ground. So, I mean, one of the reasons this research is hard to do is because it's not until 1994 that in law, a man is able to be identified as the victim or the survivor of a sexual, of rape particular, forced buggery. To use the language of the Sexual Offences Act 1994, forced buggery only becomes defined as rape as opposed to penile penetration of a vagina. That's what the law is until that point, right? Not until 2003 that forced fellatio becomes seen as sexual violence and seen in that same category of rape. So there's a really difficult kind of legal barrier to get across, because some of those sources that you might otherwise be going to, legal sources, court transcripts, are just not there because the state is not recognizing the same level of violence that they are elsewhere. So that's one of the kind of methodological challenges, if you like. But the reason that's so peculiar is that people who are working on the ground, like the activists, the survivors, are very clearly and very articulately making the case that this is not the case in reality. Survivors UK, as it is now, is founded in 1986. So there's a huge window of time when you've got activists on the ground demanding change, demanding to be recognized, but the law failing to do that. So I suppose those are what I would say there in terms of kind of a really rich history of activist and grassroots men asking for and demanding to be recognized in law, and the law until really recently failing to do that.
Yeah, I think it's also important to kind of broaden out to the international perspective, and the fact that there are lots of kind of jurisdictions around the world where which are kind of lagging behind in terms of recognizing male survivors. And of course, if you're someone who's come to this country from that kind of context, it might be kind of even more difficult to imagine that there would be a state response. And of course, we can talk about what that state response looks like for all survivors in 2021, which is bad. But yeah, I think there's a really kind of, that history of invisibility is definitely kind of present alongside the kind of broader conversations we're having in society about sexual violence. Ben, I was just wondering if you could, so this is a really interesting opportunity for me, because I feel like we never get allowed to have the conversation about male survivors on the one hand and then men's responsibilities to challenge patriarchy on the other hand. We never get to have both of those conversations at the same time. This is the first time where I've had that opportunity. And I wondered how you kind of see that connection or that kind of crossing, that overlap of those two conversations.
It's a good question. I think, let me think before I speak. That would be a good idea. What do I think about
that? Is a thing we should all be doing
I know,
in 2021, right?
On panels, you just dive in straight away. I do think that there's an element of this, right, which is rooted in masculine stereotypes and patriarchy as we know it today. And I guess the biggest part of that is like these ideas of, well, what is the biggest part of it? One is that sexual violence is often used as a tool by men across the board to oppress other groups of people. And I think a big part of that is then the conversation about, like you said, what is a man's responsibility in that conversation when we're talking about dismantling patriarchy. I think it's something we talk about a lot in very vague and like unspecific ways. I shouldn't have said that because I don't want to talk about it in specific ways, but in vague and unspecific ways. And then when we look at like those masculine stereotypes and how they play into that reality, I think that there are ideas of objectification being normalized, like there's ideas of strength and dominance and all of those things like control being things that we're taught to aspire to as young men and as boys. So the natural consequence or the natural evolution of those things into adulthood, when you add them to power and privilege and they're unregulated, is that they then metamorphosize into a very corrupt version of those things that is very harmful to other people. And so I guess in response to the question, what is the responsibility of men in tackling that? For me, a big part of that responsibility looks like, I guess on one hand, calling things out when you see them. But I think that that's an easy way to kind of brush stuff under the carpet. And I think you can say that and everybody can be like, yeah, that is our responsibility, and move on from the conversation. I think actually it looks like a lot of interrogation of ourselves and our own mindsets and our own frameworks for dealing with relationships, for dealing with other people. And then also creating environments where people feel comfortable to talk about these kinds of things. Normalizing those kinds of conversations, I think, becomes very important. And there was another thing, but I've forgotten, and it will come back to me, so you can come back to me. And
give me a shout when it does,
no problem.
and if we haven't been kicked out by then.
Lol.
But no, I think that's really true. One of the things that I kind of really have paid attention to recently is, so when I started talking about the experience that sort of started me off having these discussions, is that I lost a lot of friends, and particularly, not exclusively, but a lot of my male friends sort of checked out of my life when I kind of came out as a survivor. And I think there's something there about, if we can't support each other, if a lot of people are that rubbish, how are we going to build those kind of coalitions where we can support women and non-binary people who are marginalized in ways that we're not, right? I think sometimes it's a sort of get your own house in order type thing that maybe is the bedrock and the baseline. I guess, I'm curious, how much has this conversation about solidarity and support kind of evolved over the years? Like if you had to describe the arc in not a 9,000 words journal article, but in a pithy way, what are some of the shifts that have happened?
It's a really interesting question, which I'll preface by saying I've not been doing this research for all that long. So this is one of the things that's an aim to find out. But generally speaking, I mean, one of the evolutions I think is that there is, the fact that we're having this conversation now, that there is a general shift towards a more open dialogue about male survivors of sexual violence and masculinity more generally. Right? These conversations are generally tied into, or perhaps should be tied into, broader questions about mental health and about the threat of toxic masculinity, that kind of stuff. And that is a real shift, and I think a shift that we've seen relatively, it's a relatively speedy transition. If we look at when Survivors UK is founded in the late 80s, right, this is a really marginal part of the conversation, if it's a part of the conversation at all, right? What is unfortunate is why that shift has happened, and I think really it's tied to another epidemic, an epidemic of male suicide, right? That this has really driven the conversation as to why is it that why is it that masculinity is something we should be taking seriously and something that has, dangerous potential? That's something we've only really seen in the last kind of decade, really driving us to the point where we are now. Whereas before, they're really, in the last kind of 40 years, those conversations have been really marginal. And I think, going back to what we've just been talking about, I think it is that kind of looking in, what we all recognise that needs to be done, this looking in at yourself. Lots of people on various levels, institutionally, societally, and individually, this is a massive challenge, right? This is the kind of the challenge that the conversations I imagine you're having with your friends, right? Some of those, the impact some of that seems to have is a challenge to masculinity, right? And as we've been hearing about kind of all day, but in this conversation perhaps especially, like as you've just described really nicely, what masculinity is if we take that really kind of one-dimensional, quite toxic view of what masculinity is, what is it serving to do? It's serving really kind of two functions. It's telling us that men are invulnerable to rape, it can't be done, and that if it does happen to you, then don't talk about it, no emotions, that kind of stuff. So when a different version of masculinity is presented, it really challenges that societally really dominant projection of what masculinity looks like. So there's something kind of quite, that challenge is really big and really societal. And some of that work is happening now, but it's really, we're, I think, in early days still of that, but the pace of change is really encouraging. So the more conversations that go on like this, I think is doing a lot of work to drive that change forward. But I suppose the final thing I would say, because often we like to see that arc, don't we, of progressive change, is that we should always be wary of that, and that always be worried or conscious of the fact that we can move backwards as well as forwards. And that, one of the major threats that is facing the work that certainly you two are both doing is funding, right? And one of the major risks is that funding will dry up, or that funding will continue to be limited. We've heard the shocking statistics this morning about how little funding for rape crisis centres there are. This is a politically produced problem that may not get better before it gets, may not get what, you know what I'm trying to say.
Might get worse before it gets better.
Correct.
Yeah, that's the one. No, and I think that's a really important point. I think very often we sort of conceptualize sexual violence against men as something that happens as a very small problem, or as kind of a slice of a pie chart, kind of rather than something which affects a pretty big proportion of the population. Like we're talking, people kind of throw around the number is 1 in 6 men. Probably we are looking at something that is actually higher than that. That's a significant chunk of men in the world, and it is something that kind of cuts across pretty much all communities as well. It's not kind of 1 in 6 men, and they're all living in Manchester and London. It's 1 in 6 men in every community. I think that's something that we're not kind of sitting with, and certainly when you look at where in the country the funding for services is as well, that's a real concern. There are entire pieces of this country where there isn't a huge amount of local support.
Can I say something on that? Just really quickly on that, the 1 in 6 number, you would hope that would be enough, and as you say, that's almost certainly an underestimate of what's going on. You would think that would be a rallying cry to our leaders to do something. And why is it not? It's because they are radically underestimating even more the figures to March 2020. The government is estimating that about 1 in 100 men have been the victim of rape and sexual assault. 1 in 100 instead of 1 in 6. This is a major difference in numbers, but that's what they're going on. So it's no wonder that we're having to have organisations like the organisation called 1 in 6 and Survivors UK pushing for change, because the government is not recognising the state of play.
Yeah. I think also one of the things I'm more and more curious about, and one of the reasons I'm so happy to be here, is how we can have these conversations in a kind of joined up way. So I'm a trustee for a specialist support service. I think specialist kind of support based on gender is incredibly important. But I wonder if kind of anyone has anything to say about how we join that up with other organizations that are supporting women, that are specialist LGBT services, kind of how we have a more joined up conversation, because it sometimes feels like we separate them out, and that's helpful some of the time, but unhelpful other times. I was wondering if people have thoughts. I have thoughts, I'm not going to lie.
Before I answer that, I just want to say I'm having a really weird experience in this moment, and I'm feeling quite emotional. We didn't say thank you to you for your poem, first of all. I really appreciated that. And I think you have shared a vision of what it is that we're aiming for here in this conversation, right? Which is the ability to sit down and talk about it. Not something that's easy to do. And I'm also feeling like this weird, like, not from you guys are doing great, but this weird like pressure on myself to like be composed. And I wonder if that's linked to the conversation. Do you know what I mean? Like if that's my own masculinity showing up in a very strange way in this conversation, in this moment. Because when we came in, I was chill. And I think like I'm not scared of panels, I'm used to them. I felt prepared. And now I feel like, oh my gosh, like I want to say the right thing or do the right thing. So I just wanted to note that before we move on. But I think in response to what you asked, another big part of this for me is how do we have this conversation as men in a way that allows us to be in a position where we're not in the forefront of the conversation. And obviously not for survivors, they should be in the forefront of the conversation. But I think there's a part of masculinity that shows up in working collaboratively with other organizations and with other people that makes it really hard to do. And a big part of that is that feeling of like wanting to know the answers and wanting to be right and wanting to not have to ask for help and seek guidance and all of those things. That means that we get into this weird cycle of like recreating the will. And actually there are organizations and groups that have been doing this work successfully for periods of time on smaller scales. And I think maybe this is about positioning, especially for organizations that are working with male survivors, about positioning ourselves in a space where we're able to learn and we're able to take advice. And I think I know that in my own work that it's hard to like go into a meeting with another organization and be like, oh yeah, we just want to know what you're doing and tell us all the amazing work that you're doing and how can we learn from that and how can we borrow those models or copy those models and embed them in the work that we're doing. But I think that's probably a big part of it. I know that collaboration piece can be hard. I don't know more about the specifics, but you said you've got ideas, so.
No, but I think the answer gives us kind of all the tools we need, right? Like it's emotional vulnerability, which thank you for. Yeah, it's really odd. At the mic, I can be really vulnerable, and then I go into work mode. It's very, really strange, compartmentalizing. But no, I think we need emotional vulnerability, and I think we also need, like, chat. Like, it is literally about being in spaces together and having kind of human-to-human connections between the people who are doing the work, right? And that's where we can discover the really good points of collaboration. That's kind of where kind of calling out and calling in can happen in an incredibly productive way is in the context of well-supported, well-resourced relationships. I think that's actually something that we need to kind of really think about is, I love action points, like I love an action point, but I think we need to do more relationship building. I think that's something that is really, really missing in us. I'm going to get very slightly political here. In our sort of capitalist, I lost half the room. There's just like the three libertarians. But in our kind of productivity focused way of dealing with these issues, where we know that we have goals to meet, we know we have funding obligations to fulfill. All of us, I'm sure lots of people came here thinking, I'm going to learn how to tackle this issue better in my life. And these are the things I can do, and that's great and important. But I also think it's about that skill of relationship building, which is frankly not one that a lot of men are taught to do growing up. And so I think developing that skill of holding relationships and holding space for each other is kind of job one, or job zero even. Like it's the baseline, it's the groundwork.
Maybe just to add one thing to the point there about funding, is that not only is it the fact that we're kind of, the people who are doing this work on the ground are generally under-resourced and overworked, but again, this is politically manufactured, right? And the competition for funds demands that we break ourselves off into this kind of, single issue, whatever. And there's some of that makes sense in terms of, it makes sense that some people, as was described very well this morning, people wanting to see themselves in the services that they're provided for. But the fact that that competition for funding is literally that, competitive and purposefully competitive, serves to break down some of that relationship building sometimes. So we have to be pragmatists about this a little bit. I don't anticipate a change in government anytime soon, and I don't anticipate a change in funding structures anytime soon. So working within that imperfect system requires the kind of relationship building you've just described, and to have that will, which is there, right? I think is a really important first step, as you've just said. And it's not only so important for that reason, but we know that many male survivors of sexual violence do, because of the increased visibility of groups like Rape Crisis Centre or whatever, often go to organisations who maybe are not able to or not trained to support them. So it makes complete sense for us to be having these conversations in a joined up way. We just, unfortunately, the will has to come from us, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and it can work. I think one of the really positive things that's happened recently is the London Survivors Gateway, which is run beautifully by the Women and Girls Network, and it's essentially a one-stop referral point, so that if you experience any kind of sexual violence within London, you call the London Survivors Gateway, and they will signpost you right away to the most appropriate service. That's only London, though. Right, it's not the same in other parts of the country. It's not the same in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. I'm actually not sure how many male survivor services there even are in Northern Ireland. Not going to say a thing that I haven't fact-checked, but I'm not sure. Are there any? I don't know of any. But yeah, I think having those kind of joined-up structures and having that kind of relationship resource is really important, because it lets us, the people doing the work, and I don't just mean services, I mean families and friendship groups and communities, it lets us dictate what that relationship looks like, rather than that coming in a top-down way. Yeah. So one of the discussions that is kind of rumbling along in lots of male survivor spaces is about the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which is the kind of overarching government strategy that deals with all sexual violence in England and Wales. And there's a parallel situation in Scotland, although they're slightly different. But essentially, how it works in England and Wales is that all the sexual violence data is kind of reported under that strategy, regardless of the gender of the victim and the perpetrator. So kind of I would count as a male survivor of violence against women under that strategy, which is a weird situation, and it makes it slightly challenging to have some conversations, because you're sort of under an umbrella in a space because the government says so, but that's not necessarily how services and those of on the ground, that's not necessarily the most useful model for us to be interacting based on. And I just think there is a big piece that's about not leaving this conversation to the other people whose job it is to think about it. It's about saying, actually, does that work for our communities? Does that work for the relationships that we all have with survivors of different genders, who we are all in relationship with, whether we are aware of it or not? This is our conversation. This is not a conversation that comes from the top down.
And I think there's a general, not to make a comparison, there's a general understanding of the reality of, I think especially in the last couple of months, of the reality of sexual violence against women, right? And most people, I know one of the conversations that I've been hearing over and over again is, you definitely know somebody who's experienced that. And I think when it comes to men, that number 1 in 6, right, that means we all know someone. We all know people who have experienced sexual violence. And the fact that in day-to-day life, I don't mean at like conferences where we're sitting on stages, but in day-to-day life, you don't hear those stories. Those are not stories that people either feel comfortable to share or feel safe to share, or for whatever reason they're not talking about them, means that all of these things are, as you said, being invisibilized, right? So I think that is an important thing that we've got to figure out, is how to make those conversations that people feel comfortable to have, and also conversations that people feel comfortable to hold space for. particularly men holding that space for other men. Because then we get into the whole bag of like emotional literacy and men not being taught to do that work and men relying on women to do that work for them throughout their lives. So how do you create spaces where we can do that? And I don't know if you have any opinions on that.
I have some opinions.
Okay, good.
Do you want to so it's a really interesting question, and I think one that I feel reasonably well placed, because I did have this experience where I had a moment of, I do not identify publicly as a survivor, came out, did a BBC Three documentary, it was good, it was find me later for a coffee, we'll talk. It was a good experience, I learned a lot. But, I did lose people from my life, and so I can look back and say, well, what was the difference between the people who left my life and the people who stepped up and really supported me? And I think the one kind of thing that the people who were willing to step up and support me had was an ability to be uncomfortable and sit with it. Like, that was the thing, because there were lots of people who were just, no one thought, oh, my male friend is going to come and say he's been sexually assaulted. Like, they were just like, oh, I didn't even think this was really came out of the blue. And there were some people who actually said, do you know what, I can't deal with this from a male friend. In fact, I had someone who messaged me about 3 years later when I'd done another public-facing thing and said, I really screwed up there because I was so used to having this conversation with the women in my life. And I thought that I thought at least I didn't have to deal with it from the guys. And it just felt like it was too much for her. And it was shitty. It was a shitty feeling, but I can kind of understand where that came from. But I think that's an awareness thing. I think that's a kind of a piece which is about kind of really understanding the reality. And also when you find that yourself in that situation, going, okay, this is an uncomfortable thing. I don't know how to sit with it. My instincts are going all sorts of haywire. But I'm gonna kind of figure out how we breathe through the next couple of moments. And that, sometimes it's as simple as that.
It's really interesting to hear about that word discomfort, right? Ability to be uncomfortable, because one of the things I've been really struck by looking at some of the ways in which male sexual violence survivors are discussed in the media is there does seem to be a real difference between how that's discussed versus how women who experience this are discussed. And we heard from Rachel Thompson in the panel just before Radical Rest about the just unbelievable fact that this always turns into a debate. When there's a call-in, when there's a discussion on the TV, this will become a debate rather than a discussion about an issue, right? Now, I'm very happy to be corrected on this, but I haven't seen that be so much the case when talking about male sexual violence survivors. And I wonder if it's because generally certainly what I've seen, it's always marketed as, look, this is going to be an uncomfortable discussion. So Ian Dale has done 2 call-ins, I think, on LBC on this topic, and marketed it specifically in that way. So you already lose the people who are going to maybe, I don't know what, but probably the people you need in that conversation maybe are thinking, I'm not up for this, for whatever reason. But it's always talked of in, this is going to be uncomfortable, whether it's because it's going to unsettle how you think about men or masculinity, or it's going to be, triggering. But it's always set up in that way, whereas the conversations elsewhere in the sector are still talked about as uncomfortable, but in less of a kind of leveling way. I don't know. It's just something I've noticed.
Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting piece here where it is, I think, useful to kind of compare experiences between men and women, where we've talked a lot about the normalization of sexual violence against women. And I think normalization is the wrong word when we're talking about sexual violence against men. It's a pushing away, and it's kind of an othering. There was a study I read at university. Feel free to shame me for this. There's a study I read that I cannot remember the author of and cannot find anymore, but I promise it exists. But they looked at the language of victim blaming and compared how people victim blame women and men. And there was a subtle difference. The way people victim blamed women was often about agency. It was about saying, you did this, or you should have done this, or you should have taken these actions. With men, it was much more about the type of men they were. It was about saying, you're this type of person, and that's why this has happened to you. It's about saying that the language was often about it being bizarre or supernatural or weird or out there. Literally out there, something that happens away from us. And so I think it's useful to kind of think about the different ways in which blame happens.
May I just say one thing that made me think of that, and actually made me think of another study that I also can't remember the name of the author of.
Oh, good,
so
we're all
this
doing
happens to us all. But, when, it's made me think of the fact that another point of similarity, we've heard again this morning about two things that go on when we think about generally female victims, which is the fact that you can have aberration, that rapists, the terrible stranger rapist, that's what we're seeing a lot of around Reynard Sonata, right? About the fact that it is so unusual, and the most prolific rape case in British history led to a lot of kind of conversation and a lot of press attention, but has been very interesting in how it has made an aberration of the fact that men are capable of raping other men. But you also get much more commonly, in that kind of victim blaming stuff, conversation about gay and queer men, right? The fact that groups in that category are really hypersexualized by media sources that talk about them. You then get people who say, oh, well, the same kind of victim blaming rhetoric that you would get around, promiscuous women. It's a very similar rhetoric of around gay and queer men. So that kind of comparison there is it's there anyway.
Yeah, and it's something that translates into actual violence as well, because we know that, again, Survivors UK have just released a study on the prevalence of sexual violence against gay and bisexual men, and you're looking at kind of between 40 and 50% prevalence among those populations. So it is something that translates into kind of real harm. We're gonna, on that slightly horrible note, we're gonna move to questions, comments, thoughts, rants and reviews. So there's a roving, right in there, yep. There's a roving mic, so if you just put your hand up.
Hi, firstly, thank you for sharing your poem. It was really moving to hear that. And thank you for being vulnerable. My question is primarily for Ben. Sorry, I'm fully targeting you. I'm really interested to know what conversations you're having, particularly with really young boys and really young children in the classroom, in primary school, because I'm 23, wasn't at school that long ago, and I have so much faith and optimism in the work that's being done to change the curriculum, on the changes that have been made in the last couple of years on consent, on knowing your body, on boundaries, there's so much positive change, but obviously it was quite a while ago that was at primary school, and I just think that that's just some brilliant work that's being done, the fact that you're going into schools and having conversations with younger people. And I'm just really curious to know what conversations you're having with young boys in particular, really. Thank you.
Thank you for asking. This is a really hard question, because the answer is really sad that we're not working in primary schools, which is crap, I know. And I think in part that's because the statutory guidance for the things that we can talk about don't require specialists at that age. So from year 6, year 5, year 4, year 3, all the way down to reception, doesn't really require people to have specialist knowledge to be able to have those conversations. I think a lot of that is about laying the bedrock of understanding. So it's not so much, from what I understand, and I don't do the work, but it's not so much teaching critical and analytical thought to children of that age. I think it's a lot more about giving them the language and the words to articulate what things are happening, what parts of their body that things are, how consent works, what consent is, rather than delving into so the work that we do with kids aged 12 and above is a lot of critical thought and a lot of questioning of why things are the way they are, where those things come from, how we arrive at those stereotypes, how we arrive at those norms, and whether we like them or not, and what we would change about them. But I do agree with you that work is fundamental and crucial, and I think it needs to be happening super, super young. And I think teachers probably need some, it's hard to say, isn't it? Because teachers are like the most overworked and underpaid people in our society, actually. But I think they would benefit from some more, I'm not even going to say that. Teachers need help. That's what they need to be able to do that work
and
better.
money.
But also not just teachers, families. And I think actually a big part of this conversation also is that we've relegated the responsibility of raising children to schools and kind of said, oh, you lot need to do that work for us because we can't be not. Wow, I don't know where this is coming from in me today. But yeah, I think that parents.
We knew this was going to be the panel where someone got cancelled, right? Like.
It's me, everyone. But I think, yeah, we as a society need some upskilling and some training in the language. Go for it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to
Strongly agree.
come in just briefly because I have done a little bit of work kind of talking about masculinity with that age group. And it's sort of, I kind of want to share a fail, or useful learning, I guess. So I did a really lovely show called Boys Don't, where we went kind of talking about emotional intelligence to boys, and the show was kind of marketed for 8 to 12-year-olds. And there was one thing that we realized was that the messages that were coming across really clearly to that age group at that age was A, violence against women and girls is wrong, B, an equality message, right? We need to people deserve to be treated equally by society. The problem was that by that age, a lot of those boys had already internalized the idea that it was their responsibility to be good at perpetrating violence and good at receiving violence, right? You have to be able to throw a punch, or at least you have to be able to take one. And the problem is you can't layer a message of gender equality and anti-violence on top of that and have it stick, because kids have such a sense of fairness. So they're either going to go, well, hang on, why do I have to sometimes experience violence on the playground, but I'm not allowed to hit the girls when people are allowed to hit me? Or they're going to go, well, girls can't be the same as boys because it's okay for us to have a fight and it's not okay for a boy to have a fight with a girl. So I think it's about, like, it just demonstrated to me how clearly the stuff we teach boys about their own consent and their own bodies sets the groundwork for having those important conversations later on. And I think by the time we get to 8 years old, actually, we're already kind of playing catch up. Awesome. Sorry, that was, I started talking in the Q&A. That's your time, not mine. Any other questions? So we've got one here, and then one here, and then one here. So we'll try and do all of those before the very nice people tell me to shut up.
Am I first? Okay. Sorry, guys. I was just going to respond to you because you made a really valid point, but then if you talk about sex ed with children, you have to preserve their innocence as much as you can, because the minute you start having those conversations with them from a young age, you're exposing them to certain things. And then it's the question of, when do you expose them to that? At what point are they being exposed to that? Because you're not with them 24 hours a day. They go to school. There's kids whose parents have shown them things that maybe you don't want your kid to know about and stuff like that. It all just gets so weird and wonderful. And then as well, in regard to what you're saying about equality, at what point does it get out of hand? Because we say, you know, like you said, it's okay for boys to hit boys and girls not to hit boys, or boys not to hit girls, but then it relays a mixed message. And then we talk about, okay, is it okay for girls to hit boys and boys to hit girls? No, it's not okay to hit anyone. But then it starts getting twisted and kids start saying why. And yeah, I mainly just wanted to respond to that.
Thank you. Yeah, shall we go here?
But I wanted to ask about the discrepancy between the stats, like the government's 1 in 100 and the kind of 1 in 6, which I assume is more on the ground level, and why that is the case, and what can be done, I guess.
Yeah, so basic number.
You will know more than me, Ben. The second bit, you will know more than me, because the fundamental answer to the question is underreporting, right? The same thing is going on that we know. Interestingly, in the same report, this is the crime survey for England and Wales to March 2020. We know. So two things here is that that's the one we're looking at the moment, because the crime survey of England and Wales to June 2021, which should be our most up-to-date survey, the numbers are just terrible because. For valid reasons, because safeguarding reasons, they weren't able to do very much in-depth questioning about sexual violence. So we have rough numbers, but nothing like the breakdown in terms of sex and in terms of kinds of perpetration. But in the March 2020 survey, the numbers for female survivors is 3 in 100, and it come on, nonsense. So in both cases, chronic underreporting is what's going on, and in terms of what can be done differently, if to just take both in general, not an easy fix, but massive overhaul of how the CPS functions would be very high on my list of things to overhaul, because so many people are not. The trickle-down effect of why people are not reporting is because they know that the police are going to question them, even though we're seeing some good improvement in police victim interaction. Police generally are going to be really adversarial with victims, because they know that's what the CPS are going to do, and the CPS are not going to bring a case, because the CPS have forgotten that they have to that their job is not to decide the verdict, but to decide whether it has a reasonable chance of getting through to the court, right? So rapid overhaul of the CPS would be high on my list. But I have no ways of doing that. So, but there are tons of things that should be done as well. But the fundamental answer to your question is underreporting, and there are cultural, legal, political reasons why that is the case. And the one thing that we can all do in terms of the really low numbers of men who report these crimes is have conversations like this, and as we've just said, to try and normalise them rather than to isolate them into spaces that are, here's a conversation to have here's your time to talk about male sexual violence. We need to be able to have these conversations in a much more open, everyday way, because that's the numbers demand that of us, because they're happening at that rate.
Yeah, and the safeguarding demands it as well, because there's no rule that says that perpetrators have to stick to one gender of victim. There's a significant chunk of perpetrators who don't. I'm kind of going through a thing at the moment where I found out that someone who had attempted to perpetrate against me had been convicted for a significant number of crimes against women. And it's a very odd feeling to kind of feel this solidarity with people who might not even kind of conceptualize that person might have hurt men as well. But yeah, I think that's about that joined upness. It's about understanding kind of how all of these issues are interrelated, and that we're all in each other's lives. And I think government structures and data gathering structures very much believe that we're not, and that's an issue. There was someone over here. Hi.
I've got a question for all of you about shame, because shame for women is one of the main reasons that sexual violence isn't talked about, and I'm just wondering how shame shows up with male sexual violence, and and what role it plays in that invisibility and the underreporting that you've talked about.
Thank you. That's such a wonderful question. Who wants to begin? I'm deliberately not making eye contact so as not to coerce anyone into.
It's a big question, isn't it? I think. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to have all of the answers about all of the different ways that shame shows up for survivors of violence, but I think, well, not even for survivors, but for all men, I think one of the ways that I have noticed shame showing up for men is in anger. And I think that is, unfortunately for men, the default response. That's the one that you come out of the box with. And no matter what you're feeling, the way that you express that is usually anger. So I think often it looks like that. I think for a lot of men, one of the conversations we're probably not having is that it looks like depression, and looks like, probably linked to male suicide statistics and attempts of male suicide. And then I think there's another slightly different response, which is that it looks like almost doubling down and leaning further into the culture that perpetuates that violence. So whether that's banter or jokes or comments or objectification or whatever it might be, it looks like almost, and I think a part of that is like an attempt to reclaim masculinity for oneself, like the feeling of it disappearing sometimes manifests in like people clinging towards it rather than deconstructing the whole thing. And I guess that again is why that education becomes really important, because the earlier people are allowed to deconstruct it means that they can move away from that as an option to deal with that kind of experience. Or there was another thing that I was thinking about before, which was that actually I think one of the conversations we haven't had today is that for men, especially young men who experience sexual violence at the hands of women, there's this kind of expectation that they're supposed to have enjoyed it, and that they're supposed to consider themselves lucky for being in that position, and actually that's a good thing rather than a bad thing. So I think there's a whole chunk of people who have maybe not even identified that that's what they've experienced, or their community around them won't allow them to identify that that's what they've experienced. And then I guess, the ways that shows up for a person can be really, really different, but I don't know if either of you have any.
Maybe just add really quickly that completely what you've just said is shown up in all of the psychological literature on this from the late 90s onwards, that men who've experienced either same-sex sexual violence or at the hands of women, as you say, really have a huge disconnect between sometimes how their bodies react and how they wanted their bodies to react. This is not uncommon as well in most survivors of sexual violence, but the fact that there isn't a wide understanding about why it is that you might become erect or why you might ejaculate in a certain situation, which might literally be survival instinct and your body just doing that. Unsurprisingly, this leads lots of men to really confused mental state, and what the psychiatric literature describes as sexual dysfunction being a major presence in people's lives afterwards. So not then, leading to all the things you say there about depression. And so there are particularly biological ways in which shame functions for men. But I think the final thing I'll say is that it also is tied really into the way in which misogyny and homophobia feed a certain kind of masculinity. That leads to a certain kind of shame being felt as well, that often heterosexual survivors feel, this again is reported as a really widespread thing that is going through people's minds after their encounter, is a questioning of their sexuality, often for the same reasons. So, the more we can do to kind of detoxify the way in which, masculinity is culturally pumped up, if you like, with misogyny and homophobia, the less that should be the case. But that is just one other example.
And to me, kind of of what both of you said resonated. I think there's a big aspect which is withdrawing, and that kind of the drawbridge coming down. That, speaking really personally, that's kind of my initial shame response is, oh my God, Tanaka, you are such a burden on everyone. You are such a burden on everyone. Close it down. And I think that's, and closing down your needs, which then bizarrely makes you such a pain to deal with. Kind of for the people around you in a completely counterproductive way. I was having a conversation with a colleague a while back who was talking really eloquently about, they're kind of not out as a survivor, so I'm not going to drop any names, but about the relationship between shame and seeking help for other things. So this particular friend is trans and was talking about how almost that sexual trauma put him off from trying to begin the process of medical transition, because it was just I don't want to think about my body. And also he couldn't differentiate that shame which was about that sexual trauma from the gender dysphoria and from those other things. So it is, and I remember thinking, my God, this is so the same withdrawing, do not be a burden, do not ask for what you need instinct that I kind of relate to quite strongly. So I think that pulling back is really big. We probably have time for one more question, and there was... guys, everyone's hand suddenly. So just back there, so there was a hand up before, so I'm going to go with the first person just in the black. Thank you.
Thank you, cheers. My question's about survivor trauma. It's more how you feel, really, rather than like a sort of definitive answer. But in thinking about trauma, do you feel that it's something that can be overcome and possibly cured, or a thing to reconcile with and live with? And I'm not suggesting that reconciling something that won't go away is necessarily worse. It might possibly be healthier. Say if I was talking to a male survivor, should I avoid saying, oh, you can overcome this, you can get through it? Yeah, just what your feelings are on that in general. For female survivors as well, possibly. Thank you.
Maybe.
I was like, yeah, that is such a good question. My gosh. Yeah. No, what feelings on it? I would say my feeling on it is I don't know how beneficial it is to speak about trauma as something that can be conquered or overcome. That's not to say anybody who's had that conversation is in the wrong. It's just my personal feeling about it. I feel as though trauma is something that we heal from and not something that we leave in the... I don't think it's something we leave anywhere. I think we carry it with us and we grow from it and we learn to live with the trauma. And I think there's a hope of healing in that a person can get to a space where that thing is not a constant determining factor in their life. It's not the place that they make their decisions from. It's not a thing that is constantly triggering to them. I think there's a lot of work that can be done to get a person to that space. I also think that's a journey. And for some people, a lifelong journey. For all people, a lifelong journey, right? And I don't think it's something that... I think in terms of like talking about it as something that you can overcome or conquer, then if a person is then to have another experience that is like, oh, no, I do feel that thing again, it makes it seem like that person is wrong. And I don't think there's any real right way of dealing with that. But I'm really interested to hear what you both think, actually.
Yeah, and I would definitely say, again, sorry, thank you for that question, because I remember particularly in the first year after the rape that I spoke about in that poem, I genuinely was not sure there was a way to survive it. Like, someone called me a survivor, and I was just like, oh, we are not there yet. So it's a really important thing to know that it is possible, and like, my life is very different. My relationship to my body is different. My relationship to sex and love and intimacy and trust, all of these things are fundamentally changed. But I have a pretty fucking good life. And I'm pretty, touch wood, I'm pretty happy and fulfilled. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, which is even though we don't have massive, massive amounts of role models of, you know, this is what an amazing life as a survivor of sexual violence looks like. We don't have lots of those full stop, but we particularly don't have lots of them for men. You know, the fact that love and fatherhood and great friendships and great work are all absolutely still possible, still on the table, is so important for us to remember and to reaffirm. And I think to avoid that thing of going, oh, well, you'll get over it, so that to make sure that we're not saying that, one really useful strategy might be to say, it's going to take a lot of work to build the kind of life that you want, and I'm here to do the work with you as much as I can. I'm here to support you in that work and acknowledge the effort it takes, because that's often kind of a better way of kind of than kind of saying it will be fine, which sometimes sounds a bit dismissive or can be taken wrong. I'm probably over time, so I'm going to bring us to a close. But I just wanted to say a massive thanks to both of you and to everyone as well for sitting with an uncomfortable conversation everyone have a deep breath. We did it. We did the hard thing. And thank you to our fantastic producers and tech
And
team
thank you
as
for
well.
sharing
They've
and for
done
your
wonderful.
poem.
Oh yeah, thank you to you.
Thank you.